Kia ora everyone, my name is Catherine Hoare. I'm from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And I'm going to build on a bit about what Jake just spoke by taking a kind of broader look at participatory mapping methodologies as a whole and provide some reflections and some lessons from our research and practice in the disaster risk reduction space. So first of all, participation or community engagement or in its various articulation has been quite a common and a cross-cutting theme for this platform and in disaster risk reduction practice and research as a whole. So I just thought I'd start by providing a brief definition of what is actually meant by participation. I could probably spend all day on this because it's a very kind of malleable and widely used term that's used to explain a whole myriad of practices and relations. But seeing as how I have 15 minutes, I'll just provide this quite succinct but yet quite comprehensive definition of what we mean by participation. So participation is a voluntary process by which people influence or control the decisions that affect them. And there's a few points of emphasis on this definition that makes it quite a useful one. First of all, obviously that's a voluntary process, so people can choose to be involved or not. And indeed, it is a process. So looking at participation not just as a means for DRR or as an outcome, but focusing on the process of participation itself. And also crucially, it's a process through which people influence the decisions or have power over the decisions that affect them. So moving away from participation as encompassing being involved, but actually looking at the power to influence decisions. So since the 90s, there's been quite a flurry and rapid expansions of quite creative methodologies to involve people, both in disaster risk reduction and participation as a whole. And of those, participatory mapping is probably one of the more common used. And by participatory mapping, I mean any participatory methodology that elicits and records in some way spatial data. Maps are powerful tools that can provide visual representations of both people's perceived realities and also their desired realities. They have the potential to foster dialogue between different stakeholders and to integrate different forms of knowledge. And crucially, and what I'm going to talk about and reflect on in the next however many minutes are remaining, is that different forms of participatory mapping are appropriate for different contexts. So different purposes, processes, and different sets of power relations. So I'll just go through some quite commonly used forms of conventional participatory mapping. So ground mapping consists of constructing maps on the ground with locally available materials such as stones or sticks, or drawing in the sand or the dirt. Another example here is where children actually use their bodies as the medium of mapping. So the map down the middle represents a runway around which their community is situated, and the children are running around using their bodies to represent different components of their environment. Sketch mapping is a common participatory method used in disaster risk reduction. So that's just free-handed sketches on big sheets of paper. So all those mapping techniques there, they're very inexpensive, they're tactile, and they're quite familiar forms of mapping. So in that way, they can be very useful in fostering dialogue between different stakeholders. So both within communities and with communities, quote marks, and with maybe implementing agencies involved in disaster risk reduction, and also maybe local governments and other stakeholders. But in other contexts, it may be necessary. So what happens in these kind of forms of participatory mappings is not necessarily compatible with what is commonly referred to as top-down or scientific or outside knowledge. In this sense, what happens in participatory mapping initiatives is often disregarded by local governments or policymakers who aren't able to integrate that quite useful information into their own scientific knowledge. So there remains to be a gap between what's happening on the ground and more top-down initiatives. So alternative forms of participatory mapping that aim to address this gap include participatory GPS mapping. So this is where people walk around in their environment and they create GPS maps to be incorporated into a GPS system. Participatory web GIS mapping, where people are able to interact with and contribute to GIS maps from their own computer. And also other forms of mapping like drone mapping, or here an example of participatory balloon mapping, where a little GoPro-like camera is attached to a balloon and can be floated over an environment and used in pre- or post-disaster risk assessments. And those can be, when the resources and the technical knowledge and skill are available and relevant, those can be very powerful tools for integrating different forms of knowledge in disaster risk reduction. But where such technology is not readily available, or there's perhaps a more broader range of stakeholders that you want to be involved, there are alternative forms of mapping, including participatory three-dimensional mapping. I won't spend too much time on this because Jake gave quite a good overview in the previous talk, but this basically consists of constructing a standalone three-dimensional model from a scaled topographic map upon which layers of geographical information can be plotted, georeferenced information using different symbols, so different pushpins and colours of paint and yarn, and the legend and the symbols themselves can be created by participants. So in that sense, it is a way to perhaps translate local knowledge relatively intact into a form upon which scientific knowledge can then be overlaid. So multiple layers of geographic information can be integrated together. It can be used to show kind of connectivities between different environments, so flows of resources, people both in everyday life and during and after disaster situations. It can be used to show seasonal use of resources and seasonal availability of resources as well. This is a really great tool for the use of involving children and youth in disaster risk reduction, because it's very tactile and it's very colourful, and it doesn't necessarily require technical skills of mapping, because the legends and the orientations can be defined and created by children, and it's a good way for them to engage in dialogue with adults, so teachers and their families and community members in disaster risk reduction. It is, however, quite a labour-intensive process, and it takes a long time, and it may not necessarily be suitable for contexts where people readily have access and interact with mapping technologies such as Google Maps and have a smartphone in their pocket all the time. So there are different kind of iterations of the same principles and processes that can be applied in different contexts. So this is an example of participatory mapping using a printout of an aerial photograph in the Hawke's Bay in New Zealand. So different scientists discussing their understandings and their views on the hazards and disaster risk reduction processes in the Hawke's Bay. So the different forms of mapping kind of have different applications and appropriate in different settings. So to include, participatory mapping can be a very powerful, yet obviously not a standalone tool for fostering people's participation in disaster risk reduction. The form and facilitation of participatory mapping will determine who participates and how. So reflecting on some of those tools, something like a drone mapping or a balloon mapping may only involve one or two people. Participatory GIS might involve only those who have a computer, or ground mapping might only involve the people that are present at the time, because it's a very temporary form of mapping. And back to what Jake was talking about, the the methods and the mode of facilitation and the attitudes of facilitation of participatory methodologies will determine who participates and how. And back to the definition of participation provided at the beginning, the process of mapping is just as important as the map itself, if not more. So participatory mapping is not about building a map, it's about fostering a dialogue, it's about allowing people to express their views and their needs and their ideas. And so that the process through which they are able to do that is a crucial part of the participatory mapping process. And also, again, it's not a standalone tool, so it can be used in conjunction with several other participatory methodologies for different aspects that constitute risk and vulnerability that don't really express themselves spatially. Yeah, that's me. Thank you very much.